Hi everyone.
Hey, happy August.
Happy August.
Here we are on the banks of the Bozeman Creek.
Yeah, Bozeman Creek running clear and fairly cold on a pretty warm day.
And this, of course, after we just saw down farther where things had come way up when the Yellowstone River was flooding, and all the riverways around here were filled with so much water, unspeakable amounts.
Yeah, just completely changing the personality and the structure of these rivers and these creeks. So if you went to a place you've gone to many times before, you show up and where am I? Because there's such a difference in the way the place looks with its new rock bars and eroded cliffs and stream channels changing. It was really quite an event.
Yeah, it's quite different from wildfires, but a disruption nonetheless, and something that reminds us that climate change is bringing on what, the flooding in St. Louis here recently, just bringing on change after change after change. And these are all disruptions. So it's interesting to me to consider how the river responds. I think we talked about this last time, but when the river gets so much water into it from melting conditions and rain conditions that are very unusual, then the river has to make its way. And it's going to cut probably a new channel. In the case of Yellowstone, many of you saw how dramatic that was, how many roads were destroyed, how many bridges went out, because that's big power coming through. But that is the way the river deals with the disruption of the additional water. We're thinking a lot this month about disruptions.
Yeah, and the theme that goes along with climate change is, evolution has arguably occurred. You may have heard of us talk about this before, but as a result of disruption, when conditions change, organisms, if they can, evolve, bring forward traits that allow them to live in a new world. But what's happening with climate change is happening so fast. Things are happening so fast. The rain is coming very quickly, and the heat is coming on very quickly. The fires with the wind and the fuel load, moisture content are happening very fast. So it's a challenge to all of us, every organism, to figure out how to thrive in that kind of high-speed disruption.
And often there's not much opportunity to figure. And so the things that show up in psychology about disruption are that this wonderful developmental psychologist named Robert Keegan out of Harvard said way back in the 80s, and was probably saying it before that and certainly since, that the way that human beings grow wiser or develop cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, even physically, is through the disruption of the environment in which they're embedded. So there's a way that you get embedded in an environment. You probably are right now. Or you may have just experienced some great loss. Or you may be dealing with something, and certainly many of our friends around the Yellowstone River Basin are dealing with great losses. That's a disruption of the embeddedness environment. Other disruptions are like the world has always made sense in one way, and you meet somebody and they say, not so fast. My experience is very different. And it's like, and you have the opportunity to grow and expand what you know, and even the way you know, by having your environment, your embeddedness environment disrupted, using Keegan's language. But so every time something like that happens, we have the option to grow. It seems somewhat easier for children. And we get to be adults, and we've maybe gone through, we're thinking maybe pretty concrete ways, or maybe we think in pretty relational ways. But when something new comes up and we refuse to take that new information in, we're going to be pretty miserable. And so this is what climate change puts right in our faces. Things are changing, and the environment is being disrupted by climate change. So how do we want to be in the face of that? How do we want to learn? Because we're not going to see it. It's going to be that fast sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes, this isn't all just about how we react. It's how we anticipate as well. What structures we keep in place that will allow us, when these unexpected disasters in some cases happen. Um, most, well, not most, all of nature has thrived in one sense by virtue of developing ways of uh, resisting or lessening the blunt force of whatever trauma is. You probably heard me mention before how lodgepole pines have serotinous cones, and they anticipate fires. Fires come through, that 20% of the cone stock is released only when flame touches it and seeds the new forest. Beaver create big pond systems that, while they may not spend a lot of time thinking about the future, it actually anticipates drought, keeps the water level up, which keeps their willow growing, which they eat, and keeps the water depth sufficient so they can make their lodges and be safe from predators. And on it goes. So a lot of us humans have the opportunity now too to say, what do we need to have in place that will allow us to weather these unpredictable events in the years to come? Because of course they're coming.
Yes, they are coming. And that brings up these questions that we found ourselves asking at the retreat just last month. What are you grieving? What have you lost? And this is, of course, a question of climate change. What is your pain around what you've lost and what you're grieving? But then, what is it that you can rely on? And the grief is something that you can carry at the same time that you can know what you can rely on. And as Joanna Macy so generously suggests, and convincingly, check her out if you haven't, carrying grief, acknowledging grief, having it with us, instead of trying to push it away, releases us into what we can rely on, and therefore what we can go forward with creativity and with responsiveness. So oddly, part of what continues in human social system potentially is our capacity to just live as a person who has lost, because that's part of what's made us who we are. And to, from there, look out creatively into this next moment that we have in our lives. I think the beaver dam is really interesting because that works unless big water comes through and knocks out the beaver dam.
True.
And then the beaver, though, we know, will just get industrious and get going again.
Very
because
quickly.
that's what they can count on.
That's what they can count on. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the issue of loss, because we live in a culture that loves the fantasy that we should be happy, and grief and loss are yucky things that hopefully we just have to deal with minimally, if at all. But in fact, it is a big part of life. And if we're afraid of it, then we're going to live in a way that distracts us from grief. But guess what? That distraction also keeps us from thinking about some of the things we can do better in response to what we're grieving, having lost. And so it removes us from our own lives if we're afraid of grief. So your suggestion of holding grief and also holding a sense of what's working, that's a very, very helpful way to go through our days.
And our instruction to be happy, if in fact that is, and it probably is the dominant instruction, just be happy, just get over it, that kind of thing. That's a surefire recipe not to be happy. And so check this part out. Disruptions happen. It's the nature of a life. And as Keegan suggested, it's necessary. It's necessary for the child to learn that the parents still exist when they're not there, so they can be really mad about it and have separation anxiety and be pretty upset. But then guess what they get to do? They get to have these fantasies about things that aren't there and aren't in the room. And they get very magical and imaginative in their thinking. And they take that through their whole lives, even as they move from that to being more concrete in their thinking. So every disruption makes it so that even we, as real grown-ups, get to keep considering what's new here, or opening to what's new here. And you don't necessarily do it in a way like, oh, I've just had a bad disruption, what's new here? Doesn't go that way. But you can have, as part of your way of being, openness to understanding that when something horrible and surprising and uncertain, that when the uncertainty delivers disruption, that you have been able to get through it before, you'll get through it again, and you will actually know more than you did before. And this is what climate change is putting right in our faces.
One last thing I wanted to point out about that, it's kind of a cool metaphor to me, is in the last year or so, scientists have discovered that when plant communities, made up, of course, of individuals, respond to climate change, sometimes they'll move up to higher, cooler elevations, but sometimes they'll move down for a variety of reasons. But the thing that surprised the scientists is they move together. They don't have half the plants going up and half the plants going down. That community responds to the new set of circumstances together. And so while we have to take responsibility for what we do, we're also part of a very big and very powerful network of humanity.
Well, and of all being, I was seeing some summary of social science about disruption. And of course, in industrial and organizational psychology, there has been this language of disruption for a while because it's been hooked up with innovation. But the real fact is that the most disruptive things, that is, things that shift the system so that the whole system changes, come from the ground up. And so it occurred to me that even we in human community, we can get a little haughty. We can forget that we're a part of the natural world. And the natural world is it's from the ground up, it's going to make the changes that it needs to make. And it will be our opportunity as nature in nature, you know, and we know, to adjust to that and to be a part of that. And so this is a kind of a radical thing, to really turn our attention to what it is that survives through disruption, and to consider the natural world and all its disruptions and how resilient it is. To watch that, because that's a superpower of that.
Yeah, and to come together and respect each other enough to allow that cooperative creativity, which is way bigger than individual creativity, to flower, because we need it. So we're off to the Elder Writers Retreat workshop, where we're going to be visiting writers, and we're really looking forward to that. Hopefully we'll be on the trail some as well in the month, and we wish a grand month of summer for all of you.
Yeah, we'll be back next month, September, on the 13th with the deep dive, so put it on your calendar, and we hope to see a lot of you there. Meanwhile, have a wonderful end of your summer. Yes.
Yeah. Enjoy your one precious life and this one precious planet.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye
All right.
for now.
See you next month.